Soon enough, you will be able to send an AI-generated version of yourself to that Zoom meeting you've been dreading, or ask it to stay on the phone for hours with customer service to cancel that gym subscription. It sounds like a dream, right? But this also means that soon enough, we will no longer be able to distinguish fact from fiction when watching the news.
I sometimes do interviews with the mainstream media here in the United States, like MSNBC, and a friend of mine who is a CEO who's connected to Sam Altman and big tech told me the other day that very soon I will no longer need to do those interviews. An AI version of myself will do those interviews, including live national or global interviews.
Media literacy was already crucial to navigate the world of a 24 hours news cycle. Now, when so much of the content we consume is created by artificial intelligence, media literacy is more critical than ever.
And we need to teach people that the people you're talking with on social media, the people you're following on social media are not people. They're AIs being run by people who want to make you think in a particular direction.
And nowhere are the dangers more significant than with the older generations.
We have a whole, certainly one generation, sort of baby boom generation, who don't have that media literacy in terms of disbelieving things online by default. They're very influenceable, and they haven't understood that most writing can be made at industrial scale by AI.
But is it fair to place the burden on individual consumers?
It's extremely difficult to place the burden on all of us to be able to try to figure out what is or is not created by an AI system or a bot or by an algorithmic system that will prioritize sensational and at times fringe conspiratorial information. There's just no way to be able to look at the ghost in the machine.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm your host, Catarina Vila Nova. This is the third episode of the special series on AI and democracy brought to you by Debating Europe. Today on the show, we understand how important media literacy is when navigating the AI era. Joining me today is Ben Hammersley, founder of Hammersley Futures and the European Young Leader.
The real danger with AI is that it's able to do the propaganda writing and the propaganda distribution at an industrial scale.
And Ramesh Srinivasan, professor of information studies at UCLA.
To place the burden on all of us is incredibly unfair.
We talk about the dangers of AI and whose responsibility is it to help us all being safe when scrolling through TikTok and Instagram. Listen now to my conversation with Ramesh Srinivasan. I wanted to start by asking you, to what extent do you think that the electorate is aware of AI's influence on the political landscape and political decision making overall?
There are likely some commonalities with the European Union and some other parts of the world, but there's widespread anxiety and confusion about, generally speaking, what we see online as citizens and members of an electorate, and why we see what we see, and whether what we see is real or not. And that's one of several factors that's contributed to greater popular and public distrust. And generally speaking, the kinds of political fragmentation that we see today, where you're either on my team or against my team. And there was already widespread concern about that related to disinformation and bots. And now, with the emergence of generative AI technologies that can create content that is absolutely indistinguishable from human created content in many different cases, I would say those concerns are even more elevated. However, I would not say that most of the public, nor is that their responsibility, are fully aware of how these AI systems work, how prevalent they are, what, if any, regulations or guardrails there are in terms of bringing that content online. But I think it just adds a significant amount of fuel to the fire, where increasingly we're moving more and more away from the internet as a sphere of open dialogue and communication toward the internet as a sphere of fragmentation and artificiality. That's a huge, huge issue as we head toward this election cycle. There is widespread distrust and suspicion of many things people see online, and that, of course, has an effect on a sense of distrust and suspicion of one another. And so, we really, really need some reforms or regulations, at least just in the short term, or at least as tied to this forthcoming election. For example, any content created by an AI system should be watermarked or disclosed that indicates that this was not created fully or solely by a human being. Of course, human beings work with technologies. We work with technologies as tools, but to delegate content to be created by an AI is disturbing and disorienting for many people. I sometimes do interviews with the mainstream media here in the United States, like MSNBC, etc. And a friend of mine who is a CEO who's connected to Sam Altman and big tech told me the other day that very soon I will no longer need to do those interviews. An AI version of myself will do those interviews, including live national or global interviews. Whether we believe that will happen in 1 year or 3 years or 7 years, that seems like a significant concern because the voices that we see online are no longer tied to any trustable identity.
That sounds absolutely terrifying unless you are one who does not like to speak to the media and you'll be happy to take an AI version of yourself to the speak to MSNBC or whoever it might be. But so, you said it at the beginning that you don't really think or believe that citizens should be the ones being aware of how much AI is influencing the political landscape. But can, for example, public education play a very significant role in making sure that citizens are empowered in AI era? And what do I mean by empower? I mean, for example, at least being somewhat skeptical to what they see online. If they see something that makes them think, this is not correct, or this sounds a bit suspicious, to make them investigate and go taking a step forward instead of just taking everything at face value that they encounter on Twitter or Instagram or whatever.
What I was trying to say is not that we shouldn't be made aware of what's going on, but to place the burden on all of us is incredibly unfair. And so what I'm getting at here is it's extremely difficult to place the burden on all of us to be able to try to figure out what is or is not created by an AI system or a bot or by an algorithmic system that will prioritize sensational and at times fringe conspiratorial information. There's just no way to be able to, to look at the ghost in the machine, so to speak. So I am all for all forms of literacy that'll give people as much awareness in the early education system, in STEM education. Of course, media literacy educational systems must take into account, at the minimum, some techniques that all of us can learn as kids and onward, so we can at least have a sort of not blind trust in what we see online. So not having blind trust in what we see online or asking questions about what we see online seems like an important thing. It doesn't seem super realistic given that we are all multitasking and we're all getting inundated with so much information at such high speed that it's very hard to wrap our nervous system around it. My main point earlier, and the same point I'm going to make right now, is that it is absolutely critical that the corporations and the platforms that are producing such content show the public some responsibility around disclosure, around what we see and why we see it. But I've been arguing this for years also in relation to social media algorithms, bots, and so on. So, the way things work, in a democracy or in some sort of market-based economy, at least partially, is when corporate and private actors follow a path where they are not accountable in the ways they should. It's critical the state or public interest organizations check their power to ensure that we have a balanced world. And that is not what's happening right now. And my main point is, of course, media literacy has to be part of the solution, but it's one of many things that need to occur so that AI systems truly serve all of us, rather than further erode our trust in one another. Mind you, also incredibly dangerous to the working and middle classes as we think about global economic issues as well.
You are an educator yourself, you're a professor at UCLA. How much space is currently given to media literacy within the realm of artificial intelligence in public education? So in here, talking about what is the current reality and what is the potential, where do you see that media literacy should take a bigger role in public education?
I think it should be part of not just, a university program, but it should be part of all primary education. Media literacy, technology literacy, data literacy, AI literacy. These are all interwoven. It should just be a digital literacy program that looks at the fact that much of life is mediated by data and digital systems, whether we like it or not. And it's critical to do to give people the tools so that they can, again, look at the ghost in the machine. At UCLA, we do have a media literacy program out of the School of Education, which is technically the school I'm part of as well. That's often taught by education faculty, but that's pretty specific. It's not some sort of broader program that every single student gets some exposure to. And it's a high level university. So I truly believe that this is a universal issue and that everybody around the planet should be provided some exposure to the basic understandings and tools so that they can understand why and how did the world end up the way it is.
We've touched upon the issue of responsibility in the beginning in terms of individual responsibility. And then later in the conversation, you brought up the businesses and platforms and why they might not be so incentivized in holding responsibility when it comes to helping the electorate making informed decisions in this AI-infused political landscape. But so just to bring this issue in just one question, so who do you believe should hold the greater responsibility? What can they do? Is it a matter of who we believe should have and who actually has the responsibility in practice? Is it shared responsibility amongst all the actors involved here?
I mean, the responsibility is absolutely in the hands of these private companies, but they're not going to take that responsibility if the rules don't force them to take such responsibility. I'm not a doomsdayer here. I actually really am not. And my podcast, Utopias, is very much like about creativity and care, and how we move forward as a planet. I'm amazed by these technologies. I just want them to ensure that they serve all of our lives, and I would actually say all beings around on this planet, therefore helping with environmental issues as well, agricultural issues, etc., maybe medical issues. But they can't place us in further spaces of division. What we need are technologies that support our active relationships with one another, that bring us into communion and conversation and dialogue. These technologies are amazing. It's incredible. Often technological breakthroughs, if you look at history with a longer view, often technological and scientific breakthroughs occur, and it takes a while for everybody to catch up, whether it's infant mortality, reproductive technology, agricultural technology, etc. But this is all moving so fast, and literally, right, the motto of Facebook used to be move fast and break things. Well, there's been a lot of fast moving and a lot of breaking. Now it's time to repair, bringing all of us back together and force and ensure that technologies serve those purposes. So that's going to take some strong muscle to place everything in a particular place. But many of my friends in the tech world, I have friends who work for these big tech companies. I have literally friends who are CEOs of some of these big tech companies or founders of some of these companies. They all tell me, that's not their job to regulate themselves. They need to have a partner in that. So that's time to do that. But that regulation shouldn't be anti-innovation. It should be directing innovation for everyone's welfare all around the planet. And that's my wider view. And that's the entire goal of everything I work on.
Absolutely. And I have a very final quick question before I let you go. If you would like to share any recommendations for accessible resources that can help individuals such as, me and whoever is listening to this conversation to help them navigate this AI-infused political landscape, can be, a workshop, a book, a movie, a TV show.
I would recommend just going online and watching some talks and interviews around generative AI, but trying to look for scholars who are doing important work in this space. So, on my Utopias podcast, there I bring on people like Andrew Yang and Ro Khanna, and we're talking about these issues. I think that there are several great scholars out there doing work in these areas. I'll just name a few. Kate Starbird has been looking at disinformation. Her work's really, really impressive. Also, my colleague Meredith Broussard, I think she just released a new book on AI. I know many people don't want to necessarily read these books, but you can also look for their interviews online and stuff. Joy Balawani had the Algorithmic Justice League, and she was looking at bias issues in tech and AI. There are a lot of interesting folks out there trying to bring clarity to all of this, just like I was attempting to do. I think the important thing is recognizing that this, like you were alluding to earlier, that we need to institutionalize this type of education and these reforms both in our educational system as well as in our larger political economy. And all of those things represent great, great opportunities that we can move toward right now. The other thing I would caution everybody around is getting too fixated or worried about the Terminator scenario, which takes us even further away from a literacy or understanding of these technologies, which is the idea that these AI systems will turn superhuman and attack us all. That's a hardly conceivable outcome at this point. There are some scenarios where these systems could become very, very powerful, sure. But right now, we have a huge issue that's staring us right at the face, which is we need to develop widespread literacy around these technologies. There needs to be disclosure, like watermarking. We have huge economic issues. We have to support people's economic security, and we have to do everything we can to protect a free press and a people's driven democracy, which is super critical with our election approaching, but just a super important global issue as well. So for me, it should never be about technology. It should never be about AI. It should be about the larger question of how we wish to live as human beings around the planet. And that should be the guiding light by which we deal with any technology.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Great, great questions and very nice to speak to you.
Coming up, I'm speaking with Ben Hammersley, founder of Hammersley Futures and the European Young Leader. So, as we all know, a well-informed electorate is crucial for a thriving democracy. But how aware do you think that the electorate is about what the influence of artificial intelligence is on political decision-making and politics overall nowadays?
I think that they're not very well aware at all, but that's not particularly surprising because I don't believe there is very much influence directly from AI on political decision making or the policy making process or governance in any form. And I say directly because I mean that, as with most technologies, a lot of the effect that the technology has on politics isn't the technology itself, it's people's idea or politicians' ideas of what that technology is or what it means. And those two things are not the same. With AI especially, I think we're seeing an awful lot of policy being created based on a fantasy, based on science fiction stories, based on people's sort of beliefs about what AI is or what AI is available today. That's not actually the case. You kind of have two problems here. There's one, which is how much is the general populace aware of any influence to politics, whether it's AI or it's something else, and the actual nature of that influence in the first place. And with AI, I think the influence that it has is separate from the thing itself. So many of the discussions that are being held within the political sphere all the way across Europe and indeed all the way across the world are very separate from the reality of the technology. A lot of the fears that people talk about, a lot of the concerns people have, a lot of the legislation that addresses those concerns and those fears isn't really addressing reality. It's addressing a fantasy world.
And when it comes to the nexus and intersection between media literacy, public education, and artificial intelligence, how do you look at the connection between these three elements? Do you look at it with enthusiasm, optimism? Does it scare you?
So media literacy and AI is certainly a major area of concern for the reasons I was just saying, which is that the AI models that we're really talking about here are the large language models. Nobody cares about image recognition systems or recommendation engines or things like that. Self-driving cars. Nobody cares about that sort of AI when we talk about politics. We're really talking about large language models. And large language models are particularly good, as I said, in creating human-like language. The real danger with AI is that it's able to do the propaganda writing and the propaganda distribution at an industrial scale. Previously, if you wanted to have tens of thousands of social media users spreading rumors or giving one particular angle to the world, you would have to have 10,000 people in a room somewhere in Moscow or wherever, typing. Now, 8 years after the 2016 election, where that certainly was the case, there were lots of rooms with people in. Now, 2024, I think we should be looking at all of the elections in Europe and the presidential election in the United States with a great deal of worry about the amount of the discourse around those elections that is artificially created and artificially amplified. And we need to teach people that almost certainly when you're talking about certain subjects, the people you're talking with on social media, the people that you're reading on social media, the people you're following on social media are not people. They're AIs being run by people who want to make you think in a particular direction. That is absolutely is a major risk that comes from AI. That is not the same as the AI itself wanting to be president, and teaching people to identify those sorts of accounts alongside teaching people to identify things like fraudulent emails and phishing attempts and criminal based things rather than political based things is absolutely, I think it's something that should be taught from as young as possible. I think it should be taught from 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds.
So you don't see any
because
way
this is the
that
world we live in now, and it's the world
artificial
we're going to live in
intelligence
forever.
can be used to counter all the danger that it arises itself when it comes to, for example, you've been talking a lot about just text-based, artificial intelligence, but there's also deep fakes and artificially created images and videos, etc. But at the same time, you also have certain softwares that are created to identify which texts, images, videos are created and are generated by artificial intelligence. Do you see any way that it can also be used, to fight itself?
Of course. So with things like image generation, that's certainly more straightforward. But when you're talking about text, and especially if you're talking about not very much text, a few sentences, or even maybe 800 words or something like that, it's fundamentally impossible to detect the difference between a human written article and a ChatGPT written article. You may read a human written article written by an extremely good writer with very, very good ideas and novel insight, and you may read that and say, this is definitely written by a human because it's really good. But the vast majority of people who write aren't really good. And so when you're talking about just normal people writing, or even just average writing compared to the best AI written things, it's fundamentally impossible to tell the difference, even if you're using the most intelligent language model itself to try and tell the difference. You just can't. And you'll never be able to, because there isn't enough information in the text to give you enough signal to detect something. In an image, it's much easier because there's so much more information in an image that you can find the area of the image which is wrong, as it were. But when you're talking about a tweet or a Facebook post or a LinkedIn post or a small newspaper article, we'll never be able to tell the difference. And so there is certainly, I think socially, we may well end up in a situation where we just learn to not really believe anything as having come from a human, unless there's almost a chain of trust that that this article appeared in the in the Times or the Guardian or Le Monde or something like that, and that the editor of that paper has met the person who wrote the article. That you can trust that there is a chain of evidence that those words came out of the fingers of somebody who's a real person. But on social media and things like that, I think we're very rapidly learning that basically everything is fake. Like, you can't really trust anything. And you kind of assume that everything is fake unless you specifically know the individual concerned. So if you're on Facebook still, which I doubt you are because you're not 70 years old, but if you're on Facebook still and you're following somebody, like you're following a family member, you've met that person, you know that what appears as if they've written it, they probably wrote it, but something that just pops into your feed that's been written by somebody else. I think even today, the default understanding is that was written by a machine for kind of bullshit reasons. The media literacy is itself evolving. And I think the danger we have in Europe and also in North America is really with the aging population. We have a whole, maybe two generations of people who are certainly one generation, sort of baby boom generation, who don't have that media literacy in terms of disbelieving things online by default. I think they're very influenceable because the assumption is if somebody took the time to write it, then it must be real. And they haven't understood that most writing can be made, at industrial scale by AI. And that's an understanding that hasn't really got through. And so they're very easily swayable, especially if the influencing that we're talking of is something that really is well crafted enough to touch on the things that makes older people more scared, more vulnerable. So this is why we see a lot more influence coming from the right than we do from the left, because things from the right are based on fear mostly, and that's very easy to trigger with AI generated content. It's much easier to make somebody scared by writing a powerful headline than it is to make people feel stable and secure and caring about their community, or
And
however
whose
you might characterize
responsibility
the politics
is
of
it
the left.
when it comes to help citizens? I don't even know how to put it. There's so many dangers here, but from identifying disinformation to, all the dangers that come with AI that, we've been exploring so far. Whose responsibility is it? Because as you've said it already, in the States, clearly the government simply cannot do it. Across the European Union, the EU is putting this responsibility on the platforms. It is their responsibility to make sure that no hate speech is allowed in TikTok, in Instagram, you name it. But besides of what's currently happening, who do you think should hold the responsibility? Is it a shared responsibility? Is it my responsibility as a citizen and as an individual to also be skeptical and not believing everything I see? Do I trust my government to be sure that I'm safe online?
There's a shared responsibility across government and civil society and also individuals. And I think in the same way as, say, personal hygiene is a shared responsibility. There are lots of things that you can do as an individual to ensure your personal hygiene, right? You have to remember to wash, right? And brush your teeth and things like that. And the government has to make sure that the water supply is clean, and commerce has to make sure that there is enough soap available. And families have to make sure that family members who are incapable of washing themselves or are likely to not brush their teeth are reminded to do so or made to do so, right? And if you had a family member who was forever rolling around in the mud and then sitting down on your favorite chair and making themselves and the chair muddy every single day, then it is your responsibility to take that person and stop them from doing it in whatever means necessary. And I think it's a shared responsibility in that way. It's a sort of a hygiene thing. And so governments can do their sorts of legislation, and there can be commercial things that help with it, and education systems can deal with media literacy and so on, and so can individuals within their families. And I think that's increasingly necessary at every single level. So, here in the States, one of the questions I'm asked a lot is, when we talk about this sort of subject, is how do I prevent my parents from watching Fox News all day? Fox News being the television channel here, which is, extremely propaganda-y, and the Murdoch, right-wing channel. It's very addictive for old people, it seems, and it makes them very rapidly go slowly mad, right? And so you hear of things of people going home, the traditional thing that happens at Thanksgiving, in the end of November in the United States, is that people go home to their families and see their families for the holiday, and they'll go in and they will just delete Fox News from their parents' television, or they'll put the child lock onto the cable box to prevent their parents from watching Fox News, something like that. And in the same way as we also lock down our laptops so that our 9-year-olds don't stumble upon pornography, right? I think it's everybody's shared responsibility to make sure that people who have the ability to vote at least understand the world they're living in.
as we come close to the end of this conversation, I want to ask you for recommendations of accessible resources that can help citizens, that can help me and whoever's listening to this episode, to this conversation, navigating the AI era.
Just go about your day with your eyes open. That's kind of like saying, how do we navigate this smartphone era? Clearly, we are living in a smartphone era. The world has been fundamentally changed in the 17 years since we've had smartphones, but it's different for every single person. You can point to all of the things that were made completely different by these technologies, but it's different for everybody concerned. And so I think just in your own life, you just have to pay attention to the things that affect you and not think of it as being this sudden change where, on the 1st of August, we're going to suddenly have the AI is suddenly going to appear and run for the commission presidency or something like that. It's more like just being aware of what people are doing and what's happening and in relation to the things you're interested in and that affect you.
And that's it for today. Policy Voices will be back next week with the 4th episode of the special series on AI and democracy, brought to you by Debate in Europe. Please take a moment now to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now, to be notified right away when the next episode drops in your feed. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and I'll be with you again next week. Goodbye.